Mary. But just to put a context, Mary asked me to come and give a talk, and I had a vision of a small group of people in a small classroom. I didn't realize coming to such a large group of people and being streamlined. So I have to say, it's a great pleasure to be here. I have, over the last couple of years, I've attended here and sat here in the audience myself, as I did the Anam Cara program here, and the Sacred Heart of Living program first, and I followed it with the Anam Cara program. So it's different to be standing here in the podium, and I feel very privileged to be here and to be able to talk to you. I know that there's a mixed group of people here, and my talk it comes a little bit from a theoretical perspective, which I'll explain as to why I've done that, and then I'm going to use the example of some of the research around nursing, and forgive me for those who aren't nursing, but we can apply it to all health professionals and to staff who are working in a very, what I would say, a complex healthcare environment. And then to talk a little bit about what I would feel is really, when we talk about resilience, we need to talk about, it's all very well to talk about resilience as if it's an individual thing, that, you know, we're responsible for being resilient, and if we as individuals aren't resilient, then the problem is with us. But working in a complex healthcare environment, we have to look at the reality is that we can only be resilient within a resilient organisation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a model that allows us capture that the idea to be resilient must be supported within an organisation as well, and within a society that supports, you know, resilience and the growth of resilience. I'm very conscious as well that sometimes resilience can be used as kind of, you know, maybe if I'm not resilient, am I a failure? And I think we have to kind of talk a little bit about that. So what I hope to do along the way is I'll go through my slides, my presentation, and then maybe we have some questions and answers at the end. I don't know all the answers. It's an area that I'm evolving for me too. And but I hope maybe that I can whet your appetite, and I always believe with students that it's about trying to engage people rather than give you everything, because the reality is I don't know everything, and particularly in this area it's definitely evolving as a topic. So without further ado, and welcome to everyone in Blackrock as well, that I'll continue. I have to put glasses on. I have two different types of glasses depending on the screen and what I can see, so forgive me for that. So why do we need to understand resilience? Certainly the term resilience is being used more and more in healthcare. It's coming up in education, it's coming up in clinical practice, and it's coming up in research. And in terms of the wider, you know, the society and community, it comes up even in terms of now we're talking about resilience in children. And the irony of that is when I start talking about where the discussion and where that whole, from a kind of a research and theory perspective came from, and actually came from work in children. But now we've gone back and we now see it as part of our education curriculum nearly, to look at how children are resilient and that. But actually all the research on resilience started with how children were coping, and that brought the development of the theory forward, which we're going to look at now. So the purpose of the talk is to explore with you what resilience is and why being resilient is important for healthcare professionals and for staff working within a complex healthcare environment. And I think that all of our healthcare environments are very complex, and so I think that's why it is something that we need to explore and I think work with together in terms of how do we become more resilient, but also how does the organisation become resilient to help us. So what is resilience? Well, it kind of started developing, as I say, within, if we look back in terms of research, the exploration of what resilience is around the early 90s, maybe a little bit earlier than that. But it was defined by Garmazia as a tendency to rebound and recoil, and actually very physics, coming from physics, the notion of what is resilience. I remember in school that was part, resistance and resilience were part of physics terms in physics. So rebounding, recalling, springing back, the power of recovery. Resilience, Rutter then has done a lot of work on resilience, a lot of papers around discussing and particularly work around children. And he said that resilience is inferred based on evidence that some individuals have a better outcome than others who have experienced comparative levels of adversity. And when we look at stress, and stress would have been something that I would have talked about, I suppose, to explain a little bit in terms of my kind of education around psychology, it would have been kind of driven certainly in my latter years of education around kind of health psychology, and that would have been kind of brought in when we start looking at coping. That what kind of influenced our thinking around coping was all the theories around stress, and so stress again was the idea in terms of how we experience stress was that how can we explain a similar experience and two different responses to it. And of course there's reasons for that in terms of what psychologists have put out in terms of explaining that. And resilience is somewhat similar, is this idea that, you know, we're now saying, well, you're resilient because you seem to be able to manage that level of stress or trauma in your life, whereas somebody else is not managing it so well. So does that make you resilient? And I think that's, you know, in this notion of inferred resilience by the fact that the outcome seems to infer a resilience on your part. So other terms that have been used, it's a term used to describe and explain complexities of individual and group responses to adverse events and difficult situations. So I think it is important that the conversation and the discussion around resilience is not just around individual resilience, that we also see it in relation to the group, and we talk about resilient groups, and that would infer then resilient organizations, resilient communities. We've talked about that, and you see it in terms of people describing how do communities recover from major trauma, and again, like what's in place and what helps them recover from trauma. So resilience definitely isn't just associated with the individual. Marston then talked about it being ordinary magic, that it's not actually something that extraordinary. It's not a black and white event. You could maybe be resilient in some areas in your life, but maybe that, you know, later on you may not be as resilient, and so maybe it's not something that you're born resilient and you remain resilient, and that it's not something extraordinary that all of us may have the capacity to be resilient. And maybe it's about looking at what helps us to maintain that, develop it, maintain it. And also then Lou and Al said that resilience could be defined in many ways as an outcome. If we're looking at it, you know, the outcome, you know, have we been resilient? Have we been able to manage to get through that? It could be a coping strategy that we may use as a, you know, for ourselves, or it could be a trait maybe that we actually are born with. And so there's a lot of there has been a lot of investigation, there's a lot of research going on in this whole area for ourselves. So does resilience develop throughout our lives? I'm not necessarily going to answer that question. I just always like to pose a few questions when particularly when I'm teaching, because I always think it's a good idea to think in your own head, well, what do you think? Do you think resilience from your position now, from your experience of your own personal experiences, or maybe your experiences through your work and through the work that you do and the people that you meet and your personal life as well? Is resilience something that you develop through your lives? Or is it something that you would say in terms of your family members, well, they just seem to always be able to bounce back easier than I can, you know? So is that something that they're born with, that we're all born with? So just to kind of give you a little whistle-top tour through, you know, where we are in our thinking around resilience, that the growth in research and resilience started with studies of children. And these were looking at children exposed to major stresses within families. So they were looking at parental mental health, marital discord, low socioeconomic group status, children who were maybe living within, you know, socially deprived situations, and maybe families that were very problematic. And the observation was that not all children who were, you know, within those situations, who grew up in those situations with emotional, like developed then emotional or social problems as a consequence. And I suppose this is the thing, that, you know, our community doesn't necessarily define us, and therefore, unlike the behaviorist perspective where they said, like, our, you know, there was a famous quote by Skinner who kind of led out on behaviorism, on that whole theory that he would say, show me the boy and I'll give you the man. In other words, the environment can in actual fact, you know, impose itself, and impose in terms of through reward and punishment, we can change people's behavior and develop in that way. But we know that that isn't true, because we have plenty of examples that while our environment does impact, and we see it through education, and that people coming from different environments may not always, you know, go to third level education. We have to look at what are the supports that we need to help people. But our environment doesn't necessarily, you know, determine who we are, but it certainly can influence us. So this idea about looking at resilience, in the early days, they looked at it. They looked at the time, they were looking at what are the risk factors to a child within those situations, in terms then of their mental well-being and their future, I suppose, development into adults. And they changed the question to what are the protective factors? So what is protecting the child within this environment that may be quite dysfunctional? And what is helping that child grow, you know, into an independent adult, without, as I say, a legacy maybe of emotional problems. And that became the kind of difference around the research, in terms of helping to explain maybe what resilience is, or giving us another opportunity to explore resilience through another lens for us. So in terms of what they found, they said they looked at the different types of protective factors. So instead of looking at risks, let's look at what our strengths are. And you can see where I'm kind of moving with this, in terms of the growth of kind of focusing on our strengths rather than our weaknesses. So we without a doubt, all of us are born into the world with a particular, you know, disposition to develop a lot of different things, and all the work now on the genome, in terms of, from a health perspective, identifying different DNA patterns that may determine whether we become, you know, develop certain diseases and that. But within that, for ourselves, the DNA is there as well, maybe in terms of our temperament. You know, I remember as a midwife that I trained as a midwife for 2 years in the Coombe Hospital, and I didn't work for a long time as a midwife then, as a staff midwife. But my time as a student, mainly in the nursery, in the postnatal ward, you'd always see, because those days rooming in wasn't as much a common thing, so the babies were always brought to the nursery at night to give the mothers a rest. And you'd see even within the little cots, and these little young babies, like a couple of hours old, a day old, like you know, some of them were aggressive in their cots, banging when they, you know, wanted food. By God, you knew about them, you heard them. And other babies were very gentle, genteel, and that was within a 24-hour period of life, you know, where we didn't really have an environment that would have influenced them that way, that much. So there is, you know, temperaments, there are, you know, dispositions that we have that might be within an environment more conducive to us becoming resilient. And obviously the affectional relationships with family members, providing emotional support. And there is huge work, as we know, around attachment and the need for attachment, and the need for children to have very firm attachments with at least one or two caretakers, specific caretakers. In the past, we looked at attachment and Bowlby's theory of attachment around the mother. And Bowlby would have said that it was absolutely important, absolute need for the baby to have that contact with the mother, and the mother's relationship with the baby was relative, like the mother could take it or leave it. Now we know that's not quite true, but what he was trying to explain, that the baby needs to have that attachment, and the baby comes into the world with the reflexes that actually enable the child or the baby to bring the mother to them, such as crying, gaze, and that ability to, you know, to hold the mother. And you know, while the baby cannot see within the first 6 weeks of life, they have some peripheral vision, but they have a predisposition. They've done lots of research, I always find very interesting, is that the baby is tuned to actually be able to identify the kind of outline of a human face rather than squiggly lines, and they spend more time looking at that because they're tuned in to recognize human faces more so. And as they're so we all know, if any of you have been in the contact with young babies, that they smile in the first couple of weeks, but it's not actually a social smile. It's usually they're about to poo, or they're about to, you know, blow wind. But what happens? What is the automatic reaction to anyone who sees a baby smile? You smile back. So the child has that ability to engage you and bring you to them. And that's why smiling and, you know, responding like that is so important to the child, because the baby's bringing you into their world. Because what Bobby would have said is it's essential for that bond. So they're equipped to bring you to them. And as that then develops, and we know develops on, you know, in further on in the first couple of years, so that relationship, that emotional relationship, we now know is really, really important. And while there would be, you know, lots of criticism around some of Bowlby's work, there's a lot of, you know, he would say that mothers have to be the person to be with the baby for between 6 months and 3 years, because he would say that attachment has established itself at 6 months. That they would have to stay, that his theory and what he was putting out there might have caused a lot of guilt with mothers who had to go back to work. And we also know there's evidence in terms of adoption studies where bonds, and those strong bonds, can be actually developed later on than 2 to 3 years. So there are some criticisms of his theory, but what he did was put out the importance of that attachment and the ability of the child to actually form those attachments coming into the world, and then the impact those attachments have. So it shone a light on the emotional development, the emotional needs that we have. So depending on the stability of that, will also influences the child in terms of their protective factors. So then we have external support. So we know that our working environment, we know that, you know, our school environment, and belonging to our spiritual care, what church we might be involved in, a religion, and we've seen the positives and negatives of that certainly in recent times. But all of those kind of external factors have protected people, and they would be seen as types of protective factors that help in terms of that growth and maintenance of resilience. So moving forward then, with all of this in mind, the emergence then of positive psychology, which is really the study of the qualities that help individuals and communities not just to endure and survive, but to also flourish. And so flourishing has become a term that in the last maybe 5 years has kind of taken, you know, a growth spurt, to want of a better word, of flourishing. The idea that, you know, that it isn't enough for us as human beings just to survive. It's also within ourselves, we also need to flourish. And that when that is blocked in some way, whether through maybe a family situation, whether through work situation, that it impacts on us greatly and can really, you know, kind of tear us down and really make us vulnerable then to other stresses that at other times we might have been able to manage very well. So emotional well-being and a sense of purpose and economic success in life were recognized as equally important experiences in the individual happiness. So while we all need to pay our, you know, to provide our home, or this, you know, basic need that we have to have a home, to have that secure base, to provide for our family, to have a level of income that we feel satisfied with, that when you go and you look and say, well, what makes you happy? And I'm sure from your own experiences of what people that you work with here, patients that you mind, the families that you care for, that you see it much more on an everyday basis, that when it comes down to it, what matters to people, you know, is once that we're fed, it goes beyond that. So it is about, you know, looking at resilience as what do we need, you know, how do we become resilient, you know, within that world that actually can actually be, I suppose, causing us great distress. So in the research then, the focus shifted towards looking more and more at protective factors. So instead of like trying to get rid of the risk factors, let's try identify what the protective factors are and let's build those up. Let's go from a strength model. And if you look at kind of mental health and the recovery model within mental health, and that is really one core focus of it. It's about let's looking at our strengths, acknowledging, yes, we may have these weaknesses or we may have these vulnerabilities. But if we strengthen the other poles within our life, well, then it won't matter that maybe one or two other things are a bit weak or a bit kind of shaky, because we can still stay firm. So this was kind of where the work in resilience was moving. So they're now looking at kind of moving a little bit forward and kind of getting more and more into the more kind of like really delving down into different areas and looking at where the research from all around is coming in. We see then, or we could say that maybe resilience is a very dynamic thing, that it's not just one thing, that it's very dynamic. And so Rutter would have talked about, you know, stealing our strength, the effects. He said that sometimes we might say, you know, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And at one sense, yes, that could be true. But also we know, and I'm sure you've seen it yourselves, that sometimes what doesn't kill us can actually make us much more vulnerable too. That it isn't necessarily followed that just because we come through a very traumatic experience and seem to survive it makes us, more resilient. Sometimes that might have taken everything out of us, and we are now actually more exposed and more vulnerable to other events in our lives. I would wonder whether you might have seen that yourselves, that sometimes it can strengthen us, the experience can make us stronger, and other times, trauma can actually, make us much more vulnerable and much more in need of care. So they're doing a lot more work between interaction between the genes and environment, and that would make our genetic makeup, and that would make sense given the whole view of the world in terms of, our genetic, like where it's going in terms of health. And like now that and as I say, I don't have a great expertise, but I do know that in cancer, more and more treatments, they're trying to identify genes, and they're basing more individual kind of cancer treatments based on maybe your gene makeup or things that they're able to identify markers. So you can see where that's going. So equally, it doesn't, it's not adverse to think that they would look at it in relation to, our genetic makeup and the environment and the interaction. So adverse or positive events lead to biological embedding, so in other words, the trauma that we may experience can actually maybe change parts of ourselves. And there's been a lot of work, and as I say, again, it's not an area that I'm expert in, but I'm very kind of, because it's quite a new area, that whole neuroplasticity, the idea that, that we thought in the past that maybe the brain stays, once we develop our brain as adults, that it's very unchangeable, that if it's damaged, it stays damaged. But now there's a lot more work being done where it's saying that things can have an impact, and maybe neural pathways can develop, and there's difference, that kind of plasticity that can occur. So we also then know in terms of the physiological measures of health and functioning, like we have a kind of a stress reaction that's a very biological reaction to threat. So when I feel threatened in any way, my body responds. And so my initial response is what we would have called the fight and flight in terms of the physiological. My body goes into automatic shutdown of some systems, such as our digestive system, because it's not really important if my life is in danger that I digest my food properly to avoid constipation or whatever. But what it is important is that my muscles become very, tense, and maybe are going to allow me run away and get out of this situation or fight off my aggressor. And so the heart needs extra blood, because the heart needs more, it needs to pump more energy, it needs to pump the blood, it needs to have more energy circulating up to the brain, or more blood circulating to the brain, filled with more oxygen, so we supply the brain with more oxygen. The heart needs, the muscle of the heart needs to pump more, our blood pressure goes up, our pulse rate goes up, and our breathing, it impacts just for that moment of intensity, and our bodies are more able. And we hear about people saying that they're going to lift rocks off people or get out of really very tight situations. But they're extremes. They're the extremes of when we're in danger, we can do these things. But of course, the natural thing is that we either fight or flight, and we either get out of the situation or kill off our aggressor, and this was the past, or we effectively died ourselves. So it didn't really make any difference how that impacted on us. And so what the models of stress would have said, that what was happening now is that's fine in the jungles, and when this notion of biological survival was very important. But what is a lot of our stress is that we respond to, maybe not in the same intense way, but similar, is that we do have an intense reaction, or we do have a reaction to stress, but because it's long term. So if we're in a relationship that's going badly, if we're in a job that has huge pressure continuously with no breaks away, then our body is at this higher state of arousal, and that's impacting on us and having that kind of physical negative effect. So the automatic nervous system and hypothalamic system, they're important physiological systems that, are respond to adversity and are part of that. And they're looking at that from a very biological perspective in terms of response rates and that. So basically, it's just to give you an idea about where the research is coming, that it's quite complex, and it's very multiple areas that they're looking at research in terms of resilience. And therefore, I suppose, supporting the view that resilience is a dynamic. It's dynamic. It's not one thing or another. So a new dawn in advancing resilience or understanding resilience. So to kind of then, I've set the scene in terms of maybe where we are in terms of our thinking around resilience, and then kind of moving in a little bit to to kind of, again, look at, well, from a realistic point of view, we're kind of going to move on. I'm just going to present just one model of resilience that I like, because I think it takes in everything. And then I'm going to move and kind of look at it from a more individual perspective. So I think this is Lou and Al, they're proposing a multi-system model of resilience. What they did is they've looked at a lot of different research coming from a lot of different areas. And they said, well, resilience isn't one thing. It's not individual. There's lots of things at play in relation to resilience. And so what they proposed was this model. They said it's a multi-system model of resilience. And I actually think it's a good way of looking at it, particularly if we're looking at it within an organization, because what they're saying is there's core aspects of resilience, kind of intra-individual factors. So my personality, you know, how I respond individually to things. Maybe we know, as I say, from a biological perspective, that some of us are more responsive and more sensitive to physiological changes in our body, more reactive. Some of us are more laid back. Some of us are more kind of like, will respond very quickly, easily off the mark in terms of that biological response. And then the internal resilience relates more to, well, the kind of factors, how I cope, and my coping in terms of how that has been developed through maybe looking at how my parents cope, looking at the relationship that I had with my parents, my friends, you know, what has influenced me, you know, to grow and develop as a person. So those are factors that influence resilience. And then the external resilience relates to all those, like, kind of the organizations that might have influenced me. If, you know, I look at my 3 sons that were highly involved in sport, so they're part of a Gaelic club. That Gaelic club, their friends, playing on teams, or the wins, the losses that they have, all of those are hugely, hugely important and be hugely influential in them. Their school, their friends, their environment, their different experiences in terms of work. So all of those things. And then we could look at it ourselves, and if we could even just go back to, you know, that awful time, the recession that hit us. Resilience did come up. If you look back in the news and the media about we're resilient, and then we all got very proud of ourselves as Irish people, because we were being talked about in Europe as if, look, we're a real resilient country. We're on our knees, you know, they've taken half our money from us, but we're resilient, so we're, you know, we're okay. And, you know, some aspects, yes, we could say we were really great and we really rallied round. And sometimes I often think, is that where Irish, you know, as a country, we're very good. When it's really we're down on our knees, we seem to be able to come up. But when things are going good, we seem to get maybe a bit lax. Maybe we like trauma a little bit. I'm not quite sure, but the social economical factors influence us, and I think that's important for us, because that allows us then explore maybe resilience, particularly in a work environment, that it can't just be about me, or it can't be about the profession that I'm in. It has to be about everything that's going on and everybody that I'm meeting, and then how the organization is supporting me and how my organization maybe is viewed within the community. Because I think sometimes, and you know, in terms of things that can happen within healthcare environments, and healthcare environments can often be in the news for the wrong reasons. And everyone within that environment, within that hospital, within that clinic, takes a hit by the very fact that they work there, you know, because how you identify with yourself. So it does influence us in terms of how resilient we are. So that's why I always just like to talk about this model in terms of situating resilience within the wider picture for ourselves. So, so you're going to have to forgive me here. What I've done is I'm going to just, the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about resilience for healthcare and staff but focusing on nursing as an example. Only what I've done is I've pulled some of the research around nursing that talks to us around this in relation, but can equally be applied across. I wasn't sure exactly, I knew my audience was mixed, but for me, I suppose I'm a little bit more comfortable with this, so if you could forgive me for that in advance, but it's very similar. And then I move on to more general things as well. So towards being resilient, towards resilience and well-being in nurses. So we know, and all professions and staff here, I would say that nursing is physically and emotionally demanding. And as I say, for all professionals and staff working, particularly working here in your environment that you're in, there's high role expectations and difficult working conditions. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, your physical environment, I mean, the physical environment is important, but difficult working conditions in terms of how much emotional demand is being called upon, and physical demand being called upon you on a daily basis, and for maybe the long hours that you all work here in the organization. So nurses working in stressful healthcare environments, in the research, what they're saying is that they may experience at different occasions, and I'm sure, and I know myself, I've been here to a good few workshops where we looked at compassion fatigue, moral distress and burnout, and all of those three areas are areas of kind of more and more, I suppose, focus. Compassion fatigue, I think, was one that has been recognized longer, particularly in the areas of oncology and cancer, around the people working within those areas might suffer from compassion fatigue, where we might give over and above the constant demand on ourselves to maintain compassion for people at a level maybe when we're not actually compassionate to ourselves, which is really where a lot of the talk is around how compassionate are we to ourselves. Moral distress is one that is growing more and more in terms of, and I think in terms of different professions and different working groups, whereby things are happening, maybe because resources are limited, and maybe because we're being educated in a way where we've been told this is the way, the gold standard of how things should occur, and then we go into practice and that's not happening because we don't have the resources to do that. So we know what the right thing to do is, but maybe it's not always happening. And sometimes that can cause huge distress, where people feel that they're not able to do what they want to do or what they feel they should be doing, and they have to do what they can. And to actually manage that on a continuous basis can be quite hard. And then burnout, just the physical burnout of maybe the demands of that may be associated with work, but also how you get to work. And we know that the environment in Ireland, in Dublin particularly, like trying to live here and live close to work isn't always an option for people. And people are traveling on a general basis, maybe 2 to 3 hours a day, on top of then having to work and having to sit in traffic on the M50, you know, or any small road. I was just myself, I had to go to Cork on Tuesday, and I thought, well, I suppose I thought, but I didn't quite maybe leave myself enough time. But I was there just trying to get into Euston Station at about, my train was at 7 and it was about 20 to 7. And of course I didn't know that they were doing roadworks just into Euston. And so I was caught there for about 10 minutes to try and get into the car park. So my stress levels were going up, but I mean, you know, trying to work through this and saying, look, we still have 10 minutes to go, but I still had to get my ticket out of the machine. And then I had to park the car, and then every single parking meter in Euston Station had a thing, does not take cards, so you can't do the cards. Unless you had like, and I needed $8.50 in cash, and I didn't have it in cash, you had to have it in coins. And then the only machine that worked, there was a queue of about 5, and the person on it was really slow. And so eventually I just said, either take a chance, I'm going to miss the train, or just leave the car. So I ran off and took a picture of the meter, and I didn't have it. You say, well, why didn't you have the app? But I didn't have the app at the time. So I got into the train at 1 minute to 7. And I got the train, and I was sitting there, I was so exhausted. I was like, hallelujah, I'm here. And so there, you know, I then had to go and download the app and and it all worked out fine in the end, but the stress levels, and that was only one day, you know. So I know colleagues of mine who come up, you know, get the train up on a continuous basis to work, and then get the bus across to UCD. So I mean, it is long haul, and I was only doing it for one day, a bit stressed. So yes, so I think that when we look at ourselves in terms of our work, we also have to look at, well, what's going on when we're trying to get to work, and what's going on when we're trying to get home from work. So in terms of, well, what they've also looked at, well, what makes a nurse resilient, and I think that these are very kind of go cross for all of us. So supportive social network. We know people who are socially supported are much more likely to be resilient. And a lot of work has been done in social support. We know when we send people home from hospital, if we're sending them home to an environment that there's no support, the chances are they're going to be back in, or they're not going to do well at all. We know in terms of mental health, and Mary just mentioned one of the projects that I was involved in with my colleague Anne Sheridan, where we were looking at, you know, looking at developing social networks for people with enduring mental health problems, because we know that those people tend to socialize, if at all, with their family or within the hospital, within the mental health services, that there's very little linking of the development of friendships outside of that setting. So we were looking at a project whereby we were matching people up with people from the community who volunteered, that they would socialize on a weekly basis for 9 months to see how that impacted. And great friendships were actually developed. So we know that if we have a good social network, if we have contacts, that these things will help us. We know, well, there's a lot of work on being, if you're optimistic. If you're an optimistic position, you're more likely to have less stress in your life, and possibly it adds to your resilience. We know that there's a lot of work being done in spirituality, and I think that some of maybe the kind of rise in anxiety might be where people are a little bit groundless in terms of maybe where they feel themselves are, or a sense of themselves, and that is not necessarily religion. It's more a sense of what guides them, what greater purpose maybe they have in their life, or how they feel. And resilient role models, and this is very important for the organization, that if you see people who you work with and people who you would view as slightly higher or working at a higher level than you, or somebody that you would look up to, and you see them being resilient, well, then you are more likely that pays off. You learn through them, and you look up to them, and you can see, well, if they can do it, maybe I can do it as well. But if an organization doesn't have and doesn't support the leadership in terms of they're not resilient themselves, well, if you see them falling apart, well, then it's much easier for you to say, oh, well, I mean, if they can't do it, like, what's the point? So this is kind of the work that's been done in terms of the kind of looking at resilient nurses. And then looking in terms of what characteristics help build resilience in nurses, again, I think we could come across to everyone. Developing altruism, optimism coming in again, finding a resilient mentor, developing coping skills, learning to face fears, developing personal set of beliefs, having a strong support system, developing cognitive flexibility would be, instead of having that rigidness around, it's either black or white, and some people have that way of thinking, and certainly in terms of looking at stress and managing stress, we know that if you are more flexible, if you can manage grey in your life a little bit more, if you're somebody who kind of is right or wrong, because, that can be okay to be right or wrong, but I think the complex world that we're in, I think we need to manage a lot more grey, that we can kind of move a little bit. It can be helpful. And then best one, I think, is having a sense of humor. We need to laugh at ourselves and with ourselves. So the impact of resilience then in terms of work, what they've said, so if we are more resilient, and looking at from the nursing research, it's associated with experiences of health and well-being, so it's good for us. It improves our work relationships and job satisfaction, and it decreases our experience of stress. So I mean, that's all very, we all know that. So the question is, so what can we do to help ourselves really around that? And we can, as I say, we can take that for ourselves. So how can healthcare organizations help support then nurses? Well, this is where, as I say, within a complex healthcare environment, it can't just be the individual, that it's up to the individual to become resilient, to maintain resilience, that it has to be supported within the organization. So you do need to have, and the research show we need supportive like management, clinical supervision and mentoring, that needs to be always in place for people. And I suppose a day like this at least helps in some of that, even opening the conversation around maybe what your needs are. Education and training days, provision of on-site wellness programs, a focus on fostering clinical teams, and then the big word, the workload. I mean, and I'm sure that that's always the issue. It's the issue in UCD, it's the issue with lecturers, it's the issue with all of us. We all do too much work. So how do we balance it out? And it's also about fairness and equity around work, because that's also often an issue too. So there are things that maybe, as I say, at a higher level, the organization can look at that would support then the individuals. So being resilient, the reality of being resilient or adaptive does not imply immunity to negative life events. And I think that's important. Just because I am resilient, or I've been resilient in the past, and if you have friends or family who you would consider resilient, don't assume that that's going to always be the case. Because sometimes we can then, if we see somebody who's very resilient, or we then maybe overload them, we then expect them always to be that way. And also for ourselves, we then maybe are not compassionate ourselves to say, well, actually, I need help now. And to come to that realization that maybe on this occasion, I am not resilient. Things are not going well for me. I may have considered that was part of my identity, but it's not anymore. so that we're not necessarily, just because we are maybe in some things, that we are that in everything, and that I think it's important for us. So ways to maintain personal resilience for all. So these are just general things. So when I talk, and I suppose I give lectures in UCD to students on stress and stress management, and that's kind of moving now into this kind of building resilience and strengthening, looking at strengths. But just for yourselves, sometimes it's not a bad idea to say, where would you put yourself on a stress scale in terms of where you are now? And it is about that, taking that pause for yourself and saying, well, look, what exactly is happening here for me? And just kind of getting a sense of where you are, so that then maybe you can then begin to look at what you might need to do for your help, for yourself. And that is something that I think is very, very hard for anyone working within an organization that's supporting people who may have health problems, and some of them have very serious health problems, because sometimes there is that thing in the back, well, I'm not as bad as. And I think a lot of us take comfort with the fact, well, my life is not as bad as. And I think that can be part of working within an environment where you're constantly seeing people who are quite unwell. And whereas other people would have a balance in their life where they'd say, well, I'm not as good as, because they're not surrounded by these. And sometimes it's okay for us to adopt that. Well, actually, yeah, I'm not as bad as this, but hell, I'm not as good as this either. You know, and that rebalances us, instead of always maybe not addressing our own needs because we feel that other people are worse off than ourselves. And that while that might seem very altruistic, and in general it is, but sometimes it's okay maybe to actually look and rejig it for yourself and say, well, actually, there's things I need too here for myself. And so this could just be a very simple, just for your exercise of just grounding yourself a little bit. So we know in terms of the work around stress that we feel stressed when there is an imbalance between the demands in our lives and the resources we have to deal with them. So a lot of, in the past, stress management would have focused on the resources. So, okay, we may be able to change some of the stressors, but some of the stressors that we experience in our lives are things we can't just kill off, run away from. You know, as in, if it's a bad relationship, well, you know, the option isn't just to give them a box and say, that's it, I'm out of here. Or, you know, your child's really, really, you know, irritating you, and say, right, that's it, I'm gone for the week, do what you want yourself. We don't have them. I feel like doing it sometimes, but we don't have those options. So we have to stay and deal with situations. So then it's about more, maybe it's about then focusing on, well, what are the resources do I have to actually support me, you know, to be able to manage this? And that in the past, as I said to you in the beginning, that resilience is only coming in the last 5 years, this kind of word about resilience. But in the past, we talked about stress. We talked about, you know, the stress would have been, we're trying to explain in psychology, why is it that two people can have the same experience and both people don't feel the same levels of stress? So now we've moved it to say two people having the same experience, and why don't they all have, are they not resilient? They're not all showing the same levels of resilience. So it's kind of moved a little bit. So just very briefly, and the only reason I'm talking about this model is I like it because what he does is, or they do, is they brought in this idea of thinking, and they brought the idea forward that we only will experience stress if in actual fact we appraise this event as stressful. So if we wanted to look at, well, how do I manage my stress or the events in my life more effectively? Well, then maybe it's looking at how I'm thinking about them. And then how I think about things, I can change maybe some of my thoughts and challenge some of my thoughts. And of course, this is coming from very much the cognitive behavioral therapy piece, that we can reframe things and look at them differently, which then will reduce maybe some of the emotional attached to it, which is being driven by the thoughts. But what influences our appraisal? What makes us think in a way that we might? So in terms then that this model is just saying that really we only experience stress when we ask ourselves two questions, and we're not necessarily asking them right on the spot, but they're saying they're driven by two questions. One, is the event stressful? Two people might have the same event. One person says, actually, this is very stressful. The other person says, actually, this is a great challenge. Can't wait, you know? And so once you've said that, the stress is gone for that person. The other question might be, yeah, this is very stressful, but do I have the resources to deal with it? Yeah, actually, I'm going to cope with this. Fine. So stress is diminished. I'm not going to cope with this. Then the stress, it becomes a stressful event. So that, in a sense, is really where that model is coming from. It allows us to take into consideration how we're thinking about it and how we think about stress. So We know that stress can be benign and positive. So benign and positive stress would be maybe, and I'm only suggesting here, marriage. If you decide you're voluntarily getting married. Now, I haven't met, my son last year got married, and it was a very, non-stressful in one way, but seemed to be quite stressful in other ways for the couple getting married and a few people around them. But this was a very positive experience. But yet there was a level of stress around organizational stress. And I haven't met anyone who said that it didn't cause them an ounce of stress getting married. So having a baby as well, if the baby is something that's planned and wanted and waited for, is again very positive, but can be quite stressful too. And then you have the harmful and negative stresses, and I think we know a lot about what they are, so we don't need to go into detail on them. And then, so they're kind of the first thing, whether or not it's stressful or not. And then the other thing is whether or not you feel you have the ability to cope with them, the pros and cons, kind of the secondary appraisal piece. So what may influence me appraising something or thinking that something might be stressful? We know the personal characteristics such as our level of self-esteem, and this is our own sense of positive self-worth that we have. And our self-esteem is, as you know, is kind of, well, the thinking would be that it's developed in our early childhood. It's developed as part of that attachment, as part of that good, positive, loving experience that we might have within our families and within extended siblings and that. And that it's our value system that we believe in our value as a human being, that our worth is not associated with what other people believe my worth to be, but it's grounded within myself and my sense of value as a human person. Now, a lot of us may come into the world, the adult world, with a good, strong self-esteem, but we know that self-esteem can be eroded through events. It's not something, again, that's constant. We know that childhood, by exposing children to positive reinforcement, to love and kindness and commitment, can help grow and foster. Also, to experiences now, what we're seeing is that we can't actually keep praising children and not allowing them to have experiences that negative things can happen, because then we're not building up their ability to be able to deal with adverse situations. So it is about that kind of growth of self-esteem. Self-efficacy is more associated with that idea of confidence, and that comes in a huge amount now. We're kind of very strong in this idea of building self-efficacy, and that really is about building confidence in my belief that I can do something. And coming from the work of Bandura around the idea that confidence is this self-efficacy I can learn it through seeing somebody else do something. So if somebody who I view as a peer of mine who actually manages, and so we take an example of being resilient, if something happens in the wars that I feel is quite a difficult situation, I see somebody who's very like me, trained up to the same level as myself, manages that, and I kind of think, well, gee, I could possibly manage that too. So we learn self-efficacy through others. We learn it through our experience of getting through things, and it seems to be something that all of our health promotion and health interactions now is about giving confidence to patients around their own ability to manage. And obviously, because with chronic illness, we know that a lot more of us moving forward are going to be living with chronic conditions that will warrant us actually caring for ourselves, physically caring that might have in the past been given in the hospital. And then that whole idea of hardiness, which is something that we say might be kind of a trait that some of us are born more hardy. And the hardiness is that we tend to feel more in control of situations, we're more accepting of challenges, and we also have a very strong commitment to finish things that we do. It's kind of personality. So with those kind of traits, if you're high self-esteem, high self-efficacy, high in hardiness, well, then your appraisal of situations are possibly going to be more that you judge them as less stressful. Does that make sense, just to give that example? I'm nearly there, sorry. I didn't think it was going to take me as long. Just to say that one of the things with any model that we talk about, particularly in psychology anyway, you always have the model saying this is what it should be like, and then we say, well, actually, it doesn't counter everything. And one thing that this model of appraisal in stress doesn't talk about is emotions and the emotional impact. And our emotions impact, of course, in terms of how we think, so how we are. So different emotions impact in terms of our experience of stress and then how we might deal with it. So we know then that the impact of providing ongoing support, it should be on healthcare professionals as opposed to healthcare professionals, is that we know that your working staff and professionals working in areas where you're constantly a physical demand on you and an emotional demand on you, that it takes its toll. And then they've done a lot of work on this, and as common emotions experience are a lot of times could be guilt in terms that maybe you're not able to do the job you'd like to do, or you would have liked things to have gone better, or maybe at times we can't always turn up and be the best person that we can be, because oftentimes we are coming from a home situation, we're coming from a travel situation, we're coming from things, and we're human and we're not perfect. So sometimes we can feel guilty about the fact that maybe I was a bit snappy, maybe I said I'd go back and I never did go back. We can be very frustrated in terms of our work and this impacts on us. We also sometimes can have a sense of personal failure in that maybe I didn't do the best job I could do. And we have things that can happen to people, and that's the nature of the work, working in a healthcare environment. And also maybe a feeling of helplessness that maybe things can't change. There doesn't seem to be any more money, there's no more resources. We know we could do things better, but we can't do them any better than they are. And that feeling of, out of control, that you're not, and depending on the role you might have in an organization, would impact on that. So we do know the idea then is that we absolutely have to then at some point look and begin to really take on board the idea of self-care. So we need to begin to care for ourselves before we can care for others. And I mean, the example of the kind of looking after your, putting on your own mask before somebody else's. And the irony of it all, and I'll say the hand on heart to myself, is I look every time I fly, I say, yes, that's a great idea. And I often then wonder, well, do I ever do it? I mean, I talk the talk, do I walk the walk? And I have to say, I'm really struggle sometimes to actually say that I do walk the walk, because I think I am more inclined to look after others. And I say, I'll do it in a minute, I'll do it in a day, I'll do it in a week. But it does take a discipline for us to actually really, really focus on that for ourselves. Because I think sometimes we talk about self-care, self-care, others need us more than us. And it's not just your others in the work, it's others at home. You're at work, you want to then be your best at home. So the multiple roles that we carry for ourselves. So we're now, I've only one or two more slides to show, but just so to pause to reflect really on maybe just some things that we just need to consider for ourselves that you already know, but I'm just going to put out there as a reminder for yourselves. So the first thing, we need to nurture resilience. So if we say that resilience, might be something that grows and we can be born with the ability to be more resilient. Our environment can allow us flourish and become resilient. But then we might move environments depending on our life, and that environment then withers, and we need to stand alone, holding the fort as it may. But then how do we maintain a resilience within an environment that may not be as supportive? So what are your resources? And I talked to the students, the fourth year students who all go out into internship particularly, and asked them to think about, well, what's your first aid kit going out now into this world of working on the wards? And obviously we're working with nurses and midwives, and in terms of their 9-month internship that they're going out in January on, and saying like, so think about it for yourselves, have it an idea, like a first aid kit, like you have bandages, you've got medications, you've got things for your hand. If you're going off trekking into the forest, all the young people heading off on their world journeys that they do, their gap years and things like that, so they bring resources. What do you bring yourself? What is your resource now? What are you going to take out when things are going wrong? What's there to pull out of? So it's like kind of visualizing with them a first aid kit and saying, let's put it in there. What's going to be in there? And amazingly, believe it or not, when I talk to them, they say, oh, it's a cup of tea. And I said, it's a cup of tea. And they said, yeah, like loads of them like to have a cup of tea, ring home, have their friends, have their family. But it's about thinking about that, just literally thinking and having it there for yourself. So what are my resources for myself? In nurturing resilience, consider who are the people in my life who are my resource. And if you haven't been in touch with some of those people in your life, it's, maybe it's not a bad idea to give them a buzz and just say, how are you? Because sometimes just hearing, and we keep saying, oh, I will. And a lot of our good friends, we don't need to be in touch with them all the time, but sometimes it's good to be in touch with them now and then and just to have that. It can be a habit that we get out of, that we're so busy. And what fascinates me is that we're so part of the communicating with everyone on phones, and we're so able, and yet we are now struggling a little bit, I think, with that communication, that human capacity to communicate, because it's so easy to send a text, the voice, what that instills in us. So to think about that for yourselves. With increasing self-awareness, hopefully, Ask yourself, how much compassion do you give yourself on a regular basis? Are you a compassionate person to yourself? Don't mind about anyone else. Do you ever forgive yourself for mistakes that you made? Do you forgive yourself for not being perfect? For maybe being, I was ratty, I was, irritable, do you ever say to yourself, it's okay? And at the end of the day, do we ever sit, and I often say it to myself, I must write down all the good things I did. And sometimes I try. I was great. And I say this to the students as well. I often say, like, what you need to do now is you need to write down how great, how good you were, like what you achieved. And they all laugh and say, yeah. Imagine, instead of writing down all the things you didn't do, and I have a huge list in work with all the things I have to do, and then I change another new list and a right list, and this and changes from this. But equally, it's been good for me to write a list and say, wow, you did this, and you did that, and you did the other. I'm great. I mean, how many times do we ever say, I'm great? We say it to our children. Hopefully most of us say, you're great. But do we ever say it to ourselves? I mean, it'd be a long time waiting for anyone else to say it to you when you get to be an adult. You're really great. I think you're fantastic. So I think let's adopt that for ourselves. I'm great. I'm fantastic. And then obviously working here, I know, because I know myself, having come out to a lot of workshops and that, like mindfulness and that whole growth in mindfulness and kind of just trying to stay within the moment and use mindfulness, meditation, all of those things to help us. And I suppose the piece with what John Kabat-Zinn brought really was the idea of compassion, and compassion to ourselves, drawing on that very strong Buddhist tradition, and I think the beauty of that for us all. But again, we need time for that, and that's the one thing we don't really give ourselves much of. And I stand here before you saying I'm exactly the same, So every time I give this talk, I say, right now, you're going to start afresh. So the next time you give it, you can say, yeah, I'm on the road. So hopefully the next time if I ever came out to you, that would be it. So I always like to just, I think this is a lovely piece of poetry. It's a lovely way of setting, and I think it's just nice to end with the idea of that self-compassion. It's from John O'Donoghue, and it's from his poem To Come Home to Yourself. And I just think it's a lovely piece. And this is the beach I have very fondness of myself, of Achill Island. So it's from Achill. And it's just, may all that is unforgiven in you be released. May your fears yield their deepest tranquilities. May all that is unlived in you blossom into a future graced with love. And that's what I wish for you today. Take care. Thank you.